Today's story might sound unbelievable, but trust me, it's all true. This is the story of Michael Malloy, or as he's better known as, one of the world's hardest men to kill. This man was subjected to 9 attempts on his life in under 3 months. But before we get into the details, if you're a fan of this kind of content, please like and subscribe, it goes a long way. It's the early 1930s, the hustle and bustle of New York City are noticeable, with jazz music setting the backdrop of a city that never sleeps. However, there's a shadow hanging over the city, and over the entire United States for that matter. That shadow is none other than the Great Depression, a time when the American dream seemed more like a nightmare to most. During these tough times, jobs were scarce and breadlines were long. Families were struggling to make ends meet, and the once booming economy was now a ghost of its former self. In this chaos was a 40-year-old Irish immigrant named Michael Malloy, who had come to New York City in the 1920s, full of hope and dreams. Michael was a firefighter, a true hero who dedicated his life to saving others. But in New York City, he worked as an engineer, fixing boilers in larger buildings. But as the Great Depression took hold, Michael, like many others, found himself without steady work and barely making enough to rent a room, with odd jobs like sweeping floors. To cope with his misfortune, Michael turned to alcohol. Even though prohibition laws were in effect, making it illegal to produce or sell liquor, bars had turned into speakeasies where they quietly sold alcohol to those who were willing to pay. The alcohol wasn't anything fancy most of the time, but it got you drunk. In this same city, there were 5 men who saw Michael's unfortunate situation not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. These men were not the kind of men you would want as friends. They were schemers and career criminals looking to make a quick buck off somebody else's misfortune, and they were about to hatch a sinister plan that would go down in history as one of the most shocking plots ever conceived. Their plan was simple yet morbid. They decided to take out life insurance policies on Michael Malloy, betting on his life, or rather his death. To them, Michael was the perfect mark, an alcoholic with no family who wouldn't be missed by society. At the beginning of December 1932, Murphy walked into the office of Metropolitan Life Insurance. When the salesman asked Murphy what he could do for him, Murphy replied that his name was Nicholas Mallory and he would like to take out a life insurance policy on Michael Malloy. Not asking any question, the sales rep issued an $800 policy. Murphy stood up, shook the man's hand, and left the office. He then walked down the street to Prudential Life Insurance Company and repeated the process. This time, he walked out with 2 life insurance policies for $492 each. But this time they had a clause that if Malloy died an accidental death, they would double the payout. This would net them a total of $2,776 back then, which is about $61,000 today. With the life insurance policies in place, all that was left was for Malloy to die an accidental death. It seemed like an easy task, especially for somebody in Malloy's condition. Tony Marino, who owned a local speakeasy, suggested to the group that he offer an unlimited tab, believing that if given the chance, Malloy would drink himself to death. In late December 1932, Malloy walked into Marino's speakeasy where he was a regular, sat down at the bar, and ordered a whiskey from Murphy, who was the bartender that night. He slid a whiskey down the bar to Malloy and then motioned to Marino, who walked over to Malloy and struck up a conversation, asking if he had gotten any decent jobs lately, how he was doing. Seemingly friendly barkeep chatter, but he was really trying to gauge Malloy's current health and welfare because their big plan depended on it. When Malloy told him the job seemed to be drying up with the heavy snows not letting up, Marino took the chance to offer him a friendly deal, saying, "Don't worry about your tab here at the bar. Being a rough time, I'll just make it unlimited for you until you're up on your feet again." "Well, then keep the whiskey coming," replied Malloy, not seeing a point in turning down the amazing offer. For the rest of the night, Malloy only left his bar stool to use the bathroom. Otherwise, he was planted on the stool until closing time. For the rest of the week, Malloy could be found at Marino's speakeasy on the same stool. All that varied was whether he was awake and drinking or passed out on the bar. By the end of the week, Marino, Pasqua, and Murphy were sitting around smoking in the back room of the speakeasy, arguing that the plan was taking too long. Drinking as much as Malloy is, how is he not dead yet? Marino suggested that he could try to speed things up by adding some antifreeze to Malloy's whiskey. Looking around the room, heads nodded in agreement. This was the new plan. The next day, when Malloy walked into the speakeasy, Marino slid a whiskey down the bar. Malloy raised the glass in thanks as he drank it down. On the 3rd whiskey, Marino started adding antifreeze before he poured the whiskey, hoping that Malloy was buzzed enough that he wouldn't notice the flavor at this point. 6 drinks later, Malloy was passed out on the bar. Marino could feel the excitement building. This was fewer drinks than normal to get Malloy passed out on the bar. Malloy stumbled his way out at closing time to his rented room. He fell a few times going up the stairs, but picked himself back up and finally made it to his bed, where he promptly passed out again. The next afternoon, Malloy waved a hello to Murphy and Marino as he sat down at the bar. The men looked at each other, shocked, wondering how this man is still alive and sitting in front of them. Marino decides to try spiking his drink again, this time with turpentine. So for the rest of the night, Malloy downs his whiskey and turpentine until he passes out of the bar again. And again, he stumbles out, up the stairs, and falls into the bed in his room. The next day, Malloy walks through the doors of the speakeasy, and his only complaint is that it's snowing again. He sits down at the bar and orders his usual whiskey. Marino slides a whiskey down, and Malloy tips it back. Marino has to up the game another notch, feeling like he's starting to run out of options. But today, he's going to try horse liniment, which is a topical painkiller for horses. So he pours some into Malloy's whiskey glass, hoping it'll work better than the others. By this time, it was becoming more of a challenge of wits to see who would last the longest, but Malloy didn't know he was playing. When Malloy showed up the next day with a normal hangover, Marino and Murphy were at their wits' end. They ran down to the basement and grabbed a container of rat poison, poured some into a glass with a little bit of whiskey to dissolve it, then filled the rest of the glass up with whiskey and slid it down the bar to Malloy. After a day of drinking whiskey and rat poison, nobody expected Malloy to show up the next morning, but at the same, they wouldn't be surprised if he did. So when he walked into the speakeasy the next afternoon, there was more of a sigh of, how hard is it to kill this man? That afternoon, Pasqua was at the speakeasy and Marino was telling him all the things he had tried. Pasqua, being the local undertaker, had remembered that he had once saw a man who died from drinking wood alcohol mixed with whiskey. Wood alcohol is an older term for what we now call methanol, which is mainly used as an industrial solvent. But as Malloy seemed to be able to drink anything, they decided to try mixing the wood alcohol with food instead. They went out and bought some oysters and let them sit at room temperature while soaking in the wood alcohol for 2 days. Then they served the raw oysters to Malloy, who was grateful for the meal and scarfed it up with another round of whiskey. When Malloy passed out that night, hopes were high, but they were slashed the next day when Malloy walked back in. Out of ideas, the last thing they could think to try is a combination of, well, everything. So they served Malloy a sandwich with rotten sardines and carpet tacks. This had to work. How could it not? After eating the sandwich, Malloy was feeling pretty good. He had a few more whiskeys and then stumbled his way through the snow back to his room for the night. The men gathered in the back room of the speakeasy to discuss their plan. It's been 3 weeks and Malloy is still walking around like nothing's happened. Feeling like poison was no longer the way to go, they decided on a more direct approach if Malloy came back the next day, which he did. When Malloy passed out at the bar that night, the men gathered him up like they were going to help him home, but instead helped him to a deserted area in a local park, took his shirt and coat from him, threw him down in a snowbank, grabbed a 5-gallon bucket of water they'd brought with them, and poured it on his chest. His body started shaking uncontrollably from the cold, and the men started walking away. Later that night, a policeman was patrolling the area and found the frozen drunk Malloy and brought him to a homeless shelter for the night, ultimately saving him from freezing to death, as the temperatures that night in January were below 0 with the wind chill. The next morning, Malloy woke up in the shelter, found a shirt and jacket, and walked right back into the speakeasy, all the time wondering how he ended up outside without his coat. He assumed he must have gotten really drunk last night. With a slight sniffle and a sneeze, Malloy ordered another whiskey to warm up. Murphy and Marino's jaws almost hit the counter when they saw him. How could they have survived the freezing temperatures last night? The men again met in the back room of the speakeasy, and one of them says, "We might have to hit this guy with a car." But it couldn't be them. They had to stay as far away as possible. Murphy tried to hire 2 drivers named Smith and McNilly for $200 and even $400, but they turned the offer down. So Murphy went to Kreisberg and Green, members of the Pants Bandit gang, who accepted the offer. So that night, when Malloy was on the verge of passing out, Marino and Murphy brought him to the corner of Baychester Ave and Gung Hill Road in the Bronx, posed Malloy in front of the taxi, and walked away as the taxi hits him at 45 miles an hour, sending him flying into a snowbank. When he rolled down into the snow-plowed covered street, they ran him over with the taxi to make sure he couldn't survive being hit twice. Kreisberg and Green drove off. After 2 days when Malloy didn't show up, Murphy went to the insurance companies downtown to collect the insurance money. But when they checked the record, there was no death certificate on record for Michael Malloy. Confused, Murphy left and regrouped with the men, telling them they couldn't get the money without the death certificates. Sure, they had done Malloy in, they figured they'd wait a little longer before trying again. 3 weeks had passed, and on the afternoon of February 22nd, 1933, Michael Malloy walked into the speakeasy saying he could really use a drink. Both Murphy and Marino rubbed their eyes to make sure they weren't seeing things, but sure as shit, Malloy was sitting in front of them, alive and well. So they slid a whiskey with wood alcohol down the bar to Murphy and got a hold of Kreisberg and Green and told him the job wasn't finished. That night when Malloy passed out, the men had to do something. So Kreisberg and Green grabbed Malloy as if helping a drunk man leave the bar and walked him over to a furnished room that was rented by Murphy. As they closed the door, they put Malloy on the floor in front of the furnace. Using a towel, they held a gas hose from the coal furnace to Malloy's mouth until his body went limp. Pasqua, who had been prepared for this night for the past 2 months, brought Malloy's body to the cemetery and dumped him in a pine box, skipping the normal embalming process. Using a burial plot he bought for charity, he buried Malloy that night in the cover of darkness before going to Dr. Frank Manzala, who signed the death certificate, listing the cause of death as pneumonia. Walking away with the death certificate in hand, the only thing left was for Murphy to bring it to the insurance company in the morning. On March 1st, Murphy walked into Metropolitan Insurance Company in New York City and requested to pay out for Michael Malloy's accidental death. He walked out with an $800 check, of which he kept $60 for himself, Marino got $150, and Kreisberg and Green got $115 each. Pasqua kept the other $360, presumably to also pay Manzala. Earlier that month, after spending 3 weeks in the hospital with a concussion and a fractured collarbone, Malloy had attracted the nickname Mike the Durable. When the police heard that he had died, they were suspicious. The man seemed hard to kill. What had done him in? So they exhumed his body from the Ferncliff Cemetery and an autopsy was performed. The findings didn't line up with what the death certificate said. The man on the table did not die of pneumonia. He died of gas inhalation. Based on a tip from what the police called of underground origin, the police honed in on the men who they called the Murder Trust and arrested all 5 members, including Dr. Manzella. The Murder Trust was held without bail on May 12th, and Dr. Manzella received a $10,000 bail, which is about $235,000 today. The murder trial resulted in Green being the only one who received a prison sentence. The other 4 were sentenced to death by electric chair, which was carried out on June 7th and July 5th of 1934. Dr. Manzella was charged with failing to report a suspicious death to the medical examiner. So that's it for today's story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, and let me know what you think on this. Do the hard times and Malloy's tragic situation justify these men's actions? I don't think so, but what do you guys think? Tell me in the comments below.